So I have a question for you. Can some good come out of these lockdowns? Well, we'll ponder that next on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution. We teach the rising generation be free. I am glad you could join me. I do want to remind you of a couple changes to the podcast. I am going live more often. I'm going to be live on more platforms. If you want to find out more, if you want to join, head over to constitutionstudy.com/live. You can find out more about what I'm doing on the podcast. I also want to let you know of a couple webinars I'm working on. Later today will be the Constitution 101 webinar. If you can, register, constitutionstudy.com/101. Register and attend. If you can't make the time, register anyway. I'll send you a link to the recording and you can watch it at your leisure. I've got some other webinars I'm working on. October, I'm planning on one about presidential elections in the Electoral College. That should be very important since we have a presidential election coming up in a couple of months. So let's talk a little bit about maybe some good news coming out of all this COVID nonsense. So I stumbled across something that Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire did. He captured some tweets from an educator and author by the name of Matthew Kay. And they told an interesting story. Quote, "So this fall, virtual class discussions will have many potential spectators, parents, siblings, etc., in the same room. We'll never be quite sure who is overhearing the discourse. What does this do for our equity inclusion work?" Does anyone else find it interesting that this person is worried about including parents negatively impacting inclusion? I'm not losing my mind. That is what he said. He's concerned about parents and other spectators. What impact that will have on their inclusion work? Wouldn't the idea to be include different points of views and learn how to discuss them logically? And notice this little subtlety, right? Parents are now spectators. The parents aren't the moral guiding force, the provider of these children. They're not the one responsible for their education. They're merely spectators in the education of their children. Does that bother you? If you have children in school, do their teachers consider you a spectator? He says, we'll never be quite sure who is overhearing the discourse. Well, in my mind, that means if you don't want people overhearing it, you're saying something you don't want people to hear. Why don't you want the parents to hear what you're teaching their children? Mr. K goes on to say, how much have students depended on the somewhat secure barriers of physical classroom to encourage vulnerability? How many of us have installed some version of what happens here stays here to help this? So this teacher's claiming that the best way to protect students is to protect them from their parents? Now, I've never worked as a teacher in a public school. I have taught Sunday school and I have taught in other scenarios. And I remember when I was teaching high school students, we had an everything here stays here policy with one caveat. See, I told all of my students on the first day of school, whatever we discuss in this room will stay here unless I believe it's a danger to you or someone else, in which case I will go with you to discuss it with your parents. See, I didn't exclude the parents. The point was, if I saw something that I thought was damaging or dangerous, I wouldn't simply bypass the student and I wouldn't ignore the parent. I would work to make sure that there was an open discussion, that all sides could be heard, and that we didn't have. I wanted to be a mediator. I wanted to help the situation. I didn't want to isolate parents and students, but that seems to be exactly what Mr. K wants to do. He says the best way to protect our students is to protect them from their parents. The subtle assumption is the parents are the problem. I find this atrocious. Now, I'm not saying that all parents are perfect. I know a lot of parents that may be part of the problem, but the vast majority of parents are not the problem. Continuing on, while conversations about race are in my wheelhouse and remain a concern in this no-walls environment, I am most intrigued by the damage that helicopter or snowplow parents can do in honest conversations about gender sexuality. Why are parents considered enemies to a safe and effective classroom? Why is this teacher so concerned that the parents are going to find out what they're talking about? Could it be they're hiding something? And I can imagine, yes, there are snowplow parents that may overly involve themselves. They may try to do the work for their child, or they may just be problems. But that's true whether the students are in class or not. All that Mr. K is really saying is, we don't want parents knowing what we're doing. We want the ability, the authority, the power to teach your children what we want them to know without any interference. Heaven forbid a parent should actually be involved in their children's education. And of course, this all forgets the fact that, with the exception of the 6 to 8 hours that the student is in school, they spend a lot of time with their parents. You see, the idea that, oh, well, we've got a safe space, what happens when that child goes home? What happens when that child takes the whatever you're teaching them and goes home and acts that out in front of their parents? We haven't considered that. So you consider parents enemies not because they're an enemy to a safe and effective classroom. That is the exception, not the rule. No, you consider them enemies because they don't want you teaching their children what you think they should know. See, when I was a child, my mother volunteered in the classroom. When I was in 5th grade, the teacher had a large class and she could use some help. My mother offered to volunteer. She came in every day and she helped manage the classroom. She helped students that needed a little bit of extra work. She could work with them more one-on-one, give them the help that they needed, and she enjoyed it so much that when I went on to 6th grade, my mother kept volunteering in 5th grade. She was involved. The teacher wasn't hiding from my mother what I was being taught or what any of the children are being taught. But now we have teachers that are afraid the parents are going to find out what the teacher's teaching them. Now, they couch this in language, well, we're worried about the child's safety, we're worried about this. No. Listen to their own words, again from Mr. K. And while conservative parents are my chief concern, I know that the damage can come from the left too. If we are engaged in the messy work of destabilizing a kid's racism or homophobia or transphobia, how much do we want their classmates' parents piling on? So Mr. K clearly admits that their goal is not educating your children, but destabilizing them. Destabilizing a child's beliefs if they don't happen to meet the teacher's social and political views. A viewpoint that seems to change more rapidly than the weather nowadays. And heaven forbid a conservative thought be discussed in the classroom. Oh my God. What happens? What would you do? Or what about the definition of racism, homophobia, or transphobia? What if they were to be challenged and discussed in the classroom rather than indoctrinated, rather than a one size must be admitted to? See, the problem we have is things like homophobia and transphobia are an irrational fear, but they get applied to everything. If you don't endorse certain parts of the homosexual lifestyle, you're considered a phobe. If you don't endorse the trans lifestyle, you're called transphobic. Let's ignore all the data that shows that transitioning does not decrease the suicide rate of transsexual people. Let's ignore the idea that we may have different opinions about what is and isn't a good way to behave. No, let's isolate them. Let's call it phobia. And let's not allow our children to be taught that you can disagree with something. And while we're on the term of racism, have you noticed that the definition of racism no longer matches what's in the dictionary? See, racism is no longer judging somebody based on their race. It's saying anything that black people don't like. See, now we're being told that if you don't support Black Lives Matter, the Marxist organization, not my words, the Marxist organization, then you are a racist. If you don't judge someone by the color of their skin, you're being called a racist. If you don't judge someone by the color of their skin, by where they came from, you're called a racist. But isn't that racist? What happened to the idea from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? The idea that we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. Racism is rampant in America, but it's not what these people are teaching. They're teaching that if you're not racist, you're racist. This is 1984. This is bizarro world. This is simply more proof that government schools are no longer places of learning. They have become the re-education camps of America. Those of us old enough to remember the gulags and the re-education camps in the Soviet Union, in communist China, in Vietnam and Cambodia, where if you didn't think the right way, you were sent somewhere to be re-educated. That's what the government school system has become. It has become the re-education camps. I am so glad that we did not send my daughter to be re-educated. Now, not everybody can homeschool, but we have to realize the public schools are there to serve us, not the other way around. It is time parents look at this person and say, they are not qualified. They're not educating my child. They're indoctrinating my child. They are dividing my child from my parent, not because I've done them harm, but because they disagree with me. They are acting like petty potentates, and it's about time we stop putting up with it. It's about time we spend less time worrying about defunding the police. We spend more time defunding these corrupt practices in our schools. Not only are parents and other concerned adults not wanted, it looks like there are those that want them forbidden from even knowing what is being indoctrinated and being poured into your child. One of the responses from another teacher to Mr. K's tweets went so far as to refer to parents as outsiders. Quote, "This is something I worry about a lot. My ninth graders read and respond to a news article in each class, and the discussions we have are really important. But many students will not participate when virtual because they fear outsiders listening and using their words against them." Apparently, this teacher has no problem with instilling her views, but is afraid that the children will not participate when others are listening. Is that because the children are afraid of what their parents will do, or afraid of how their teacher will react to what their parents may say? Public school laws were passed so that every American would have a chance at a basic education, reading, writing, arithmetic, not social and political indoctrination. Schools have gotten this far because the parents have let them. When I was in school, parents were involved, and yeah, there was a liberal bent, but it was kept in check. Nowadays, not only do parents take a hands-off approach to their school districts are actually forcing them out. I remember many years ago being approached by a somewhat distraught mother. You see, her child, who attended public school, had been taught what she thought was a very inappropriate lesson, way above her age, very inappropriate. When she confronted the principal and asked why she was not given the opportunity to opt her child out, the principal says, well, we found that if we give parents an opt-out, they tend to take it. That's right. 15 years ago, we saw schools, local public schools, saying, we don't want to give parents a chance to opt out because they do. We don't want parents' input. We don't want parents' guidance. We don't want parents having anything to do with what we teach because we, the experts, know better. And if you look at the state of education in this country, you have a country where large percentages of graduates are illiterate. They're illiterate in mathematics. They don't understand science. They have no clue about our history. They don't know what it means to be a citizen or what their responsibilities are. These experts have turned our children into slaves. And we, the parents, have let them. The question is, what are we, the parents, going to do about it? Now, I started out this episode with a simple question. Can some good come from all these lockdowns? Well, believe it or not, in all this mess I've been talking about, there is some good. First, we now have parents more engaging with their children and their education. That's good. We have parents paying more attention to what their children are being taught. That's good. And we are exposing the hypocrisy and the tyranny and the re-education of our children through the public school system. That's good. Not that it's happening, but that more people know about it. So if there's anything good that can come out of this lockdown, at least regarding our children and our schools, it's that we know. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you take this new information and use it to help fix the problem, or will you simply sit back, whine, complain, and let it continue? So yes, some good can come from these lockdowns. The question is, will we grab that brass ring and use it, or will we simply sit back and let our education system continue to spiral down the drain? So I hope that, I hope that pissed you off. I hope it really got your dander up. If you have school-age children, find out if your teachers want to keep you out of the classroom. If they don't want you to see what your children are being taught. If they think they own your children, that is their responsibility to determine what your children should and should not know, are ready to understand and what they're not ready to understand. If their job is to re-educate your child rather than give them basic information, it is up to you to change it. Throw a stink with your principal, throw a stink with your school board, make a stink. Now, hopefully this was useful. You found it valuable. If you did, I'm going to ask you to do a couple things for me. I am going to ask you to share this message. If you know a mother or father with a child in a public school, send them this video. Send them the audio. Let them find out for themselves what's actually being taught to their children. They're likely to be shocked, surprised. Share this on Facebook, share it on YouTube. Let's share this message so people can find out what's going on and then figure out how to deal with it. Now, if you really appreciate the work that I'm doing here, I'm going to ask you to head over, sign up for the newsletter. Let me know, help be engaged, help be involved. If you like this podcast, please donate. On the website, there's a donate button. The donations through the website go solely to keeping the Constitution Study podcast alive. It pays for hosting, it pays for the services. Everything I need to keep producing these comes from the donations. I don't get a dime of it. Now, if you really like the work that we're doing, consider heading over to the store. Maybe you can buy a membership, buy a class, buy a book, whatever you want to do, because this is all about education and sharing. So I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it worth your time. I look forward to seeing you next time on the Constitution Study.
Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.